Hello, welcome to our final video in our series of trade and the emergence of political entities. This is our final video for this series, where we will be discussing Mesoamerica and Ancestral Pueblo. Mesoamerica in a little bit more detail, Ancestral Pueblo basically just in passing to understand how it linked to the Mesoamerica trade network. So this is going to cover a large period of time, so it's important to have a general outline. And it's worth mentioning that you don't have to learn all of these names, all of these periods, all of these dates. It's just important to convey the complexity of this world so as to understand the transcendence of the transformations that occurred with the arrival of the Europeans and how much of the pre-Hispanic or pre-contact world carried over into subsequent periods in history. So for the Mesoamerica period, we're going to talk about the pre-classic period, basically the Olmec culture. For the classic period, Teotihuacan, the Maya kingdoms of the lowlands and Monte Alban in Oaxaca. Then the Terminal Classic, we're going to showcase a series of cities in the Yucatan and central Mexico. And of course, we're going to talk about the cities of the post-classic, that is most famously Chichen Itza, but we're also going to discuss the Toltec culture, understand exactly what it means, what it was, and then very briefly touch on the arrival of the Tarascans and the Aztecs. The Aztecs, we're not going to go into too much detail, as we will cover the Aztec Empire in our series on European conquest of the Americas. Lastly, speaking about the Pueblo people, the ancestral Pueblo, we're basically going to touch on the Pueblo I period, so only 750 to 900, and talk about the sites of Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and a little bit about the city of Paquimé. This, which is outside this strict chronology, this is important because we're going to talk about this Pueblo indigenous population when we talk about the resistance to European domination. So they will come up in a future lecture. Starting with Mesoamerica. The first thing to note is that Mesoamerica is a big space. It covers the southern half of Mexico and the entirety of Guatemala and El Salvador, and parts of Honduras, Nicaragua, and a small part of Costa Rica. If one were to measure its northernmost point to the distance between its northernmost point to its southernmost point, that would be a distance of 4,406 kilometers. I know, I've measured it in Google Maps, and surprisingly, it's about the same distance that one would travel if we would travel from Cordoba in Spain all the way to St. Petersburg. So we're talking about a big area where obviously it's prone to differences in terms of culture and languages and so forth. The diversity of the region is also stressed by the geography. There are major mountain chains. The highest point it's about 5,300 meters above sea level, and then we also have highlands that are in between those mountain chains. Most importantly, the central Mexican highlands, but also the highlands in Oaxaca, and of course the Maya highlands of Guatemala. We also have then the lowlands and a little smattering of other features. So it's a geographically diverse region as well. And this geographical diversity and the extension of this part of the world also means that there are a variety of cultures that arose throughout the history before European contact. We're going to be focusing mostly on central Mexico, Oaxaca, and the Maya area, but note that there are also other cultures that arise elsewhere. So despite this diversity, all of these cultures share some common cultural and historical traits. One of the things that defines them is the way that they perceive time. A lot of these cultures have a 260-day ritual calendar, most prominently the Mayas, but other cultures have it as well, and also a 360-day calendar, which is the day-to-day calendar that people would use. Both of these calendars would overlap, so they would start on the same day every 52 years. So the 52-year cycle of time is also an important feature across Mesoamerica, and we see how these cultures would build big buildings in certain phases using this cyclical these cycles of time of 52-year counts. We also have, of course, the major feature of these cultures is the development of agriculture, in particular maize, which was domesticated in this part of the world by about 5000 BCE, before the Common Era. In addition to maize, most of these cultures also cultivated beans, squash, and chili peppers. Diet, of course, was supplemented with certain sources of protein, depending on geography, mostly game, fishing, and also insects. And there was also domestication of small animals such as dogs and turkeys, but there were no large animals that were domesticated, no large livestock like cows or even sheep. So the domesticated animals were small in size. We're talking about a region that has different religions across different spaces and also different periods of time. But in general, there are similar cosmogonies and practices. Most importantly is the practice of animal and human sacrifice. The human sacrifice happened both as self-inflicted sacrifice and also sacrifice of captive enemies, so foreign enemies, third people. And we also have the development of the Mesoamerican ball game, which is associated to the underworld and to creation stories, a very important feature indeed across the region. Also, we have the fact that people organize themselves in city-states, much in the same way as ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy. We have a space where different polities would compete against each other, even though they shared common languages or common religious practices. These city-states, by the time of the Aztec Empire, in the Aztec language, the Nahuatl, were called Atepetl. So we have this Atepetl emerging in different places in Mesoamerica, and we have cycles of emergence and decay of different regional powers throughout Mesoamerican history. The elites that ruled over these Atepetl, that ruled over these city-states, would import jade, obsidian, quetzal, and macaw feathers, cacao, from which they would make chocolate, which is a Mesoamerican invention, and of course turquoise in long-distance trade networks. So the first culture to develop, or the first civilization to develop, is the Olmec civilization. And Olmecs, it's actually the name that the Aztecs used to talk about this area, but we don't know what they call themselves. It's possible that they spoke a Mijezoque language, and they developed in 3 sites: San Lorenzo, between 1700 BCE, before the Common Era, and the year 1000 before the Common Era. So it's roughly contemporaneous with ancient Troy. Then we have La Venta, that developed in the year 1000, would peak around 600 BCE, and then would be abandoned by 400 BCE. And this is where we see the first pyramid built in Mesoamerica. It's an earthen pyramid that was 30 meters tall. We also have a variety of large basalt carved monuments, both in San Lorenzo and La Venta. And we also have evidence for trade of goods such as jade and cinnabar, which were traded with regions that were far off in present-day Guatemala and Belize. So after this period of Olmec expansion, which is mostly it's contemporaneous with the ancient Assyrian or Babylonian Empire, we have the development of the Epi-Olmec culture, more or less contemporaneous with Alexander the Great and the subsequent empires that follow. This would be characteristic of the site of Tres Zapotes, which also carries a lot of Olmec influence, but it's important because we have the earliest writing system attested in Mesoamerica. The earliest traces of a writing system are found in this site. Later on, we'll also talk about Olmec influence outside of this region, but the most important feature of Olmec art are its colossal heads. In total, there have been 17 have been found thus far. The largest one is 40 tons. Most of them are between 10 and 20 tons in weight. And the smallest one is only 6 tons. Huge sculptures that were made using stone tools, and they were transported long distances without the use of draft animals. We have representations of specific people, probably rulers. It's not a generic character, it's not a deity, it's most likely rulers. And it's possible that they were depicted wearing protective headdress for the traditional ball game that we have discussed earlier, because the Olmecs developed in the area that produced most of the rubber from which these balls were made. In fact, some have been found dated towards the year 1600 BCE. Then we have the development of a series of motifs in Olmec art. Most importantly is a were-jaguar motif, so half human, half jaguar images. These are related to shamanism, which is common throughout Mesoamerica during the Olmec times and of course afterwards. And we have images with cleft heads, fiery eyebrows, that would later be attributed to a deity that was very important throughout Mesoamerica, that is the Quetzalcoatl, the feather serpent, also known as Kukulkan among the Maya. So the Olmecs were for many years they were called the mother culture, because so many of the traits that characterize Mesoamerican cultures and civilizations afterwards were it seemed originally developed by the Olmecs. We can see here a very famous sculpture, Señor de las Limas, where we can see this jaguar motif in the baby that is being carried by this youth. You can see some tattoos, you can see some glyphs, and of course the importance of dwarfs is highlighted here as a symbol of divinity common to Mesoamerica. However, this picture of Olmecs being the mother culture is complicated, as we see many other areas developing, some of them showing Olmec traits, some of them seemingly developing independently. One of them would be Tlatilco and Tlapacoya, which developed, these are sites that developed in central Mexico, actually in areas that are now occupied by present-day Mexico City. Then we also have a site in Guerrero and various sites in Guerrero, in the state of Guerrero, Teopante, Cuantitlan being the most important of them, and San Jose Mogote in the Oaxaca region, and then Izapa and Paso de la Mada in the Soconusco region in Chiapas. Izapa is believed to have, it's debated whether Izapa was a Maya site or whether it was Mije Soque site. But the cities of Caminaljuyu and El Mirador did develop during the pre-classic period. So the Maya are a very ancient civilization, developing its very first cities already 500 before the Common Era. moving back to the Valley of Mexico, the city of Cuicuilco developed after Tlatilco and Tlapacoya. It became the first city, the first proper city in the region, reaching its height towards the year 250 of the Common Era. But sadly, its history was cut short with the eruption of a volcano, the Xitle, which is depicted in this painting from 1948 in a very dramatic fashion. Now, the people from Cuicuilco that survived actually emigrated north and contributed to the development of Teotihuacan, which was the greatest city ever to develop in the Americas up to that point. And we're talking about a really large city, 150,000 inhabitants, that made it about the 6th largest city in the world at the time. Very cosmopolitan city with people from all over Mesoamerica living there and trading there. So people from the Gulf region, people from Oaxaca, people from the Maya regions would live in separate quarters in the city. So well-defined barrios or quarters were occupied by various people from across the region. It benefited, of course, by the abandonment of Cuicuilco, which doubled its population inside, but also it may have growth based on the control of mines of obsidian, particular Teotihuacan obsidian that has a slight green hue. It also developed a warrior culture that it would later export to different regions in Mesoamerica, as we shall see. And it critically influenced various cultures across the region. Teotihuacan had a very powerful presence in the region, roughly coinciding with the development of the Roman Empire. The city fell roughly 150 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And it was violently destroyed. It was certain parts of the center of the city, the elite residences, were destroyed by fire in the year 650 of the Common Era. Now, Teotihuacan is a huge site. It features the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun, and the Ciudadela, and they are all linked by a 2-kilometer-long avenue called the Avenue of the Dead. Now, the Pyramid of the Sun is most impressive building. It's the 3rd largest pyramid in the world after Cholula and the pyramids of Gizeh in Egypt. And we also have the Temple of Quetzalcoatl built in the Ciudadela. This building is interesting because it features this very common symbology that would become very important later on in Mesoamerican history. And one is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, which is first depicted here as clearly as it is. And we also have Tlaloc, the rain god. It's actually Quetzalcoatl dressed as Tlaloc. But Tlaloc is distinguished by these goggles that wears around his eyes. And we also have these earpieces around its ears. So Tlaloc becomes a major deity across Mesoamerica as well, and is associated with Teotihuacan expansion. Speaking of which, Teotihuacan expansion is also noted by the adoption in various places in Mesoamerica of the typically Teotihuacan talud tablero form of architecture. So slopes, that's the taluds, a sequence of slopes, those are the taluds, and tableros, vertical sections of the sides of the pyramids, which would go in a sequence, talud tablero, adopted across Mesoamerica right at the time where Teotihuacan reached this power. We also have the tripod ceramic vessels that are found in tombs of elites in very different places, far, far away from Teotihuacan, that also depict the Tlaloc image characteristic of the city. Now, Teotihuacan expansion occurred all over the place. We have expansion towards the north, and we also have expansion towards the south. Let's start with the north. Up in the north, we have the development of several cities. Cañada de la Virgen, which pertains to the Otomí culture, developed right about the time of Teotihuacan period of greatest extent. And we also have the sites of La Quemada and Alta Vista, both in the state of Zacatecas, and both constructed during the height of Teotihuacan power. Now, all of these sites in northern Mexico would later disappear. By the year 900, this area would revert back to a nomadic pattern of human occupation. So coinciding also with migrations from the north at the end of the classic period. But what were the Teotihuacanos trying to reach by setting up these outposts so far away from Teotihuacan? It's possible that they were setting up a connection with far-reaching commercial network that would reach all the way to what is present-day Southwest United States, in the area where the ancestral Pueblo, Hohokam, and Mogollon cultures developed. So Teotihuacan may have started a great commercial network that reached all the way to the southern part of the United States. Now, this area, the ancestral Pueblo region, we're only going to highlight a certain period of very small period of its history, from 750 to 900 BCE, CE, Common Era. The Pueblos is the name that the Spanish gave to the people that lived in what is now New Mexico, to distinguish the fact that they lived in villages, in pueblos, unlike the Chichimecas, which were nomadic and were the peoples that populated most of northern Mexico. So the people that inhabited this region in the classical period, so in the 750, 900 period, is called the ancestral Pueblo. And the ancestral Pueblo developed a complex system of independent sedentary centers devoted to agriculture, and each of them had their own centralized authority, it seems. They developed after the arrival and the introduction of maize, which only became widely cultivated in the area at around the year 100 of the Common Era. And of course, these centers were exporters of turquoise, which was highly regarded in Mesoamerica. So some of these exports might have gone that way. Ancestral Pueblo sites are many. We're only going to highlight Mesa Verde, which features many kivas. The kivas are these circular structures that in all likelihood had ceremonial purposes, but certainly communal purposes. And they are a characteristic feature of the southwestern peoples of this period of time. Now we have normal size kivas for 30 to 40 to 100 people, and then we have great kivas. The great kivas could accommodate as many as 400 people. The great kivas that we find in Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon belong to the largest site of ancestral Pueblo culture, and it probably housed about between 2,000 to 3,000 people at its height. After it was abandoned by the year 900, we have development of other centers. One of them, the city of Paquimé, developed by the 13th century CE. This is an interesting site because it shows traits of a cross-cultural city, so to speak. We have Pueblo architecture, adobe pit houses, and we also have the Mesoamerican architecture, characterized by its ball game court present in the city. We also have importation of tropical birds from far down south. They imported macaws, and they started breeding them to harvest the feathers for trade further north. It's possible that it may have been controlled by a Mesoamerican elite, but there are other views that point to a completely independent Pueblo tradition. And perhaps it was a completely different development altogether. But Paquime was an essential stop in the trade route, the grand trade route that joined Mesoamerica with the American Southwest. So going back to South America and going back to the period of Teotihuacan expansion, let's move south to the city, to the region in southern Mexico known as Oaxaca. The present day state is also called Oaxaca. Now, the city of Monte Alban, built by the Zapotec people, developed in that region between the years 500 BCE and 800 CE. So it's a long period of time. It may have had as many as 35,000 inhabitants, and it features a great planned acropolis that dominated the valleys below, and where we can see very clear implementation of talud tablero architecture, perhaps influenced by Teotihuacan. This is an example of a disembedded capital. That is, the people did not live in the main monumental center, but rather the elite would live in this acropolis, and then most of the population would live in the valley below, not in the main city. Now, Monte Alban was abandoned by the year 800. And afterwards, Oaxaca was dominated by a different people called the Mixtecs. They spoke a different language, not Zapotec, and they will continue to dominate most of Oaxaca until contact with the Europeans. But in fact, they coexisted with the Zapotec. They just reorganized themselves across the territory. The Mixtecs exported cochineal dyes. So it's a type of dye, a very intense hue of red that was harvested from a specific insect in the Mixtec region. They would also make objects in gold. They are, in fact, the finest goldsmiths in Mesoamerica, as attested by Tomb 7 in Monte Alban. Monte Alban is a Zapotec site, but Tomb 7 was built during Mixtec time. So it's from the 14th century, and it's one of the best examples of goldsmithing in Mesoamerica. The Mixtecs also wrote, we also have preserved some of their codices. These are dated to the 14th century, and they retell stories of royal lineages. So again, we have the city-state form of political organization and a focus on royalty and lineages. We also have a prolific use of calendrics in these codices, and these remain important parts of Mesoamerican culture to this day. But as important and as impressive as these Mixtec writings are, they pale in comparison with the writings of the classic Maya, which we turn to next. The Maya developed a complex system of writing that features these very, very beautiful hieroglyphs. It's a complex system of writing. The earliest extant examples are dated to 300 BCE. So it's also quite old. It was a writing system that was completely developed completely independently from other writing systems. It was deciphered in 1973, so we now have a lot more information about the classic Maya than other peoples in Mesoamerica because of that. And this writing could be carved in stone or written on paper or deerskin. Paper is always said to be a Chinese invention, but in fact, there was paper in Mesoamerica as well, developed independently from China. We also have a numerical system based 20, which has positional value of signs and also features the number 0. We also have 3 signs, so the dot, the bar, and then the symbols for 0. And in these writings, in these codices and these monumental writings that we find in stelae and in other stone monuments across Maya cities, we have detailed information about dynastic lineages of kings, the Ayao, as they were called by the Maya. So these Maya cities were already flourishing by the end of the Olmec period, but there was an abrupt change in the way that the Mayas lived their lives when Teotihuacan arrived in the scene. And we see this exemplified in the city of Copan, that is way down south in present-day Honduras. The city was established by 159 Common Era, but it was ruled by a dynasty whose founder, Yaxcu Umo, was represented dressed as a Teotihuacan warrior. You can clearly see the Tlaloc goggles and earpieces. It also features the largest Maya text in the form of a staircase that features 2,200 glyphs. But the most important example of Teotihuacan intrusion into the Maya area can be seen in the city of Tikal. Tikal was one of two major Maya cities with about 90,000 inhabitants at its height. In Tikal, we can see a stele where we have a prince from Teotihuacan, Yaxnu Nahin I, which is clearly identified with Tlaloc, and he was installed as a ruler of Tikal. We can see in this image the Tlaloc motif with the goggles and the earpieces. Around this time, in the year 378, Tikal started an aggressive policy of expansion, militaristic expansion, perhaps also imported from Teotihuacan, based on a network of alliances with other Maya city-state. So warfare began in a very real fashion around this time, and most of this warfare was centered around the rivalry between Tikal and the other great city of the Maya lowlands, the city of Calakmul. And these two cities would fight Star Wars, as they would be called, because they would be synchronized with Venus. There was the brightest star in the firmament. The planet Venus is seen as a morning star. So they would start these wars to coincide with the cycles of Venus. There are two major wars, incidentally, by the way, completely unrelated. George Lucas actually used the city of Tikal to film part of the movie Star Wars. This is just a very strange coincidence. I doubt that George knew anything about ancient Mayan history. But there were two major Star Wars. One dated at about the year 562, when Calakmul defeated Tikal, and then another one in 695, when Tikal defeated Calakmul. It seems that the Calakmul kings did not like this Teotihuacan influenced dynasty that Tikal was running. The violence of this period is exemplified in Maya art, and perhaps the most important of manifestation of this violence and this art are the murals painted in Bonampak in the year around the year 790 of the Common Era. Calakmul, like I said, was a big rival of Tikal. Is the capital of the Serpent Kingdom. It was even bigger than Tikal, and it had about more than 6,000 buildings at its height. Calakmul actually used its power to subdue other allies of Tikal, such as Palenque. Palenque was actually conquered by Calakmul. And it was ruled by a dynasty that is well documented, that existed from 431 all the way into the early 800s. And the most important king of this lineage is Pakal the Great, whose tomb was found inside a pyramid in Palenque, the first time where a tomb of a ruler was found inside a pyramid outside Egypt, which made Palenque a very famous archaeological site indeed. Pacal was one of the longest ruling kings of the Maya world. He started his rule when he was just a boy and died at a very old age. And he actually restored Palenque after the catastrophe of its defeat against Calakmul. So Palenque was a victim of these proxy wars between Tikal and Calakmul, which were the great rivals, very much like Athens and Sparta, or even the US and Russia that were fighting all of these proxy wars using allies and pitting them against each other. So after this series of wars, we have a period which is known as the classic Maya collapse, because from the year 700 until 900, hundreds of cities in the southern Maya lowlands, the Petén region, were suddenly abandoned. It also coincides with similar shifts in other places in Mesoamerica. So the end of the classical period, we see a lot of cities being abandoned all across the region. Perhaps it was due to this endemic warfare. It could also be associated to droughts, deforestation, volcanic activity, or perhaps more simply a rejection of the monarchical system of government, because the other Maya cities that flourished after the classical period were actually ruled with council systems of government rather than the dynasties of kings and queens. One of these Maya cities of the terminal classic or epiclassic is Uxmal. In Uxmal, we don't see a dynastic series of kings. Instead, we have a planned city. We have a communal, traces of a communal type of council type of form of government. The city was planned. It features some of the most beautiful art styles in the Maya world. So this different art style is called the Puuc style. The Puuc is also the name of the region. And it features some Central Mexican influence, but the direction of this influence is unclear. We do have images of Quetzalcoatl or of Kukulkan, of this feather serpent that we saw back in Teotihuacan, featured in many places in the beautiful stone carvings on the buildings of Uxmal. Uxmal was abandoned by the year 900, and in its place we had a city that features a lot more Central Mexican type art or architecture. That's the famous city of Chichen Itza, that was occupied already in the classical period, but the most important part of this city's history is the Toltec or New Chichen that was built between the year 1000 and 1200. It became the major center of power in the Yucatan, and we have this Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan motif that we can see in these columns. And we also have this Chacmol figure, this human figure, reclining figure, that is also very prominent in Central Mexican sites. And lastly, we have the Zompantli, or the school rack, that is very, very clearly used in Central Mexico around this time as well, and all the way through Aztec times. Now, of course, the most famous building in Chichen Itza is El Castillo. It's the most famous pyramid. It's perhaps even more famous than the Great Pyramid of the Sun. It's a temple dedicated to Kukulkan, and it's the largest structure in Chichen Itza. We also have the Grand Ball Court, which is the largest ball court in all of Mesoamerica, almost 100 meters in length and 30 meters wide. This is a substantial building. Here's another image just for you to see the scale of this building. And after the fall or the abandonment of Chichen Itza, we have the emergence of another city, the city of Mayapan, which supplanted Chichen Itza as a major power in the Yucatan. It became a seat of a council-based form of political organization, a league, the Maya League, and smaller in scale than preceding cities. It's very much emulating the architecture of Chichen Itza. and it was abandoned about 100 years before European contact. Its rulers became heavily influenced or even taken over by Central Mexicans by the 14th century, and according to Maya chronicles written in colonial times, it was actually destroyed by a Maya uprising in the year 1441. But it's rather unclear. So let's go back to Central Mexico. What happened in Central Mexico after the fall of Teotihuacan? After the fall of Teotihuacan, we have, in fact, the rise of many cities, many centers, many cities around the region that were subjects of Teotihuacan that actually took advantage of the power vacuum left by Teotihuacan to rise to new heights of power. We're only going to highlight a couple of them. One of them is Cacaxtla in the state of Tlaxcala, dated between 650 to 900 of the Common Era. It showcases the largest and most beautiful murals in Mesoamerica, where we can see representations of Quetzalcoatl and Venus and all of these symbols that we saw originally in Teotihuacan. So it's it's continuing this Teotihuacan tradition. So strong Quetzalcoatl symbolism. We also have the eagle warrior that would later become prominent among the Aztecs, among the Mexica. But we also see a certain influence of Maya art. So it's unclear the direction of this influence, where the Central Mexicans influencing the Maya, or where the Mayas influencing Central Mexico. It's really unclear, and it's not a very well documented period of history of Mesoamerica. In the same vein, we have the city of Xochicalco, where we also have a very famous relief of the feathered serpent. It's probably its most beautiful feature. And it also rose between those years, 650 to 900 CE. In Veracruz, we have the magnificent city of El Tajín, less well known than other sites, but definitely worth a visit. It was a major exporter of vanilla and tobacco even during Teotihuacan times, and it flourished a lot more after Teotihuacan's the destruction of Teotihuacan. It features the Pirámide de los Nichos, with these niches, 365 in total. So it's also evidence, the same as the number of days in the solar calendar. So it also reveals a very strong use, a very sophisticated use of calendrics in the Tajín culture. It was violently destroyed by 1230 CE. Around the same time as the Toltecs were destroyed, or at least the city of Tula in Hidalgo. Now, the term Toltec is a little bit complicated. Upon European arrival to Mesoamerica, everyone in Mesoamerica was talking about the Toltecs as a long gone, very powerful Mesoamerican empire. And traditionally, this empire has been identified with the city of Tula in Hidalgo. However, the city of Tula is actually rather small, so it doesn't seem to fit this description of a grand empire. However, we do see some features that are very reminiscent of the city of Chichen Itza. Again, we don't know whether it was Tula influencing Chichen Itza or the other way around. But definitely there is no archaeological evidence, substantial archaeological evidence for this Toltec empire. But it did provide, this story of the Toltec empire, provide the basis for later Aztec propaganda that would justify Aztec expansion across Mesoamerica. So the Aztecs imitated Tula, but perhaps exaggerated the importance of the city so as to establish their own predominance across Mesoamerica. Toltec actually means great artisan or craftsman. So instead of a specific empire, the Toltec culture may refer to a more general idea of civilization. civilization characterized by refinement, sophistication, agriculture, urbanism, as opposed to nomadic lifestyles. The notion may have arisen from the memory of Teotihuacan, or perhaps one of the many or all of the epiclassic centers, Cacaxtla, Cantona, Tajín, or Xochicalco, that dominated the central Mexican region at the time. Toltec could refer to a city dweller as opposed to Chichimeca, which is the name employed to refer to the nomadic peoples that inhabited the lands north of Mesoamerica. So perhaps the Aztecs were trying to create this idea of portraying themselves as successors of an empire, which was really more imagined than anything else. But indeed, they were taking on all of these traits of sophistication of the city dweller, and this idea of Toltec, it becomes important, much more the idea than the actual empire itself. So another city that emerged at the time, but actually managed to outlive Tula and Tajín and Cacaxtla, is the city of Cholula. Cholula was found, again, flourished by the time that Teotihuacan decayed, and it features the largest pyramid in the world measured in volume. And this is the largest, so it's larger than any of the pyramids built in Egypt. It's so large that the Europeans thought it was a mountain, and they actually built a church on top of it. So you can fit an entire church on top of this pyramid. That's how massive it is. You can see the church on top of the pyramid pictured here. The city of Cholula was conquered in the year 1200 by Nahuatl-speaking peoples who were migrating from the north. We will see these are the same peoples that would later found the Aztec Empire. So perhaps these are the peoples who are trying to invent this tradition of the Toltec Empire, so as to seem less alien to the peoples that they were conquering as they were arriving from the north. These are the same people that destroyed Tajín, the same people that destroyed Tula in the state of Hidalgo. But Cholula outlived these invasions, and it continued to be a major pilgrimage destination because it was a center associated to the cult of Quetzalcoatl. So it remained a major city all the way through European contact. In fact, the city of Cholula continues to be inhabited to this day. Let's move to end this lecture to West Mexico. In West Mexico, we have a very different tradition, which is called the chef tomb tradition, and it has possible South American influence. South American influence is also indicated by the development of metallurgy in this region. Around the same time as metallurgy is being developed in Peru and in Ecuador and other areas in South America. We have very characteristic ceramics, such as the famous Colima dogs that you can see pictured here. Funny looking dogs that talk about how they would domesticate these animals, and also this playful nature of art among these peoples in Western Mexico. We also have architectural models made in ceramic that gives us a lot of information about the way that buildings were made and the ways that spaces were used for human habitation throughout history. But in West Mexico, we have essentially two cultures. One from the classic period, that's the Huachimontones culture, that had its peak between the year 300 BCE and the year 400 CE, so coinciding with the height of Teotihuacan. This is called the Tenochtitlan tradition. There is no Teotihuacan influence to the extent that we see in the Maya region or in Oaxaca. That is, we don't see talud tablero buildings, although we do see some imports of obsidian, but we definitely do not see as great an influence of Teotihuacan in this region. There might have been contacts with South America, and the city of Huachimontones reached a population of about 30,000 inhabitants. It's characteristic circular pyramids and city building patterns are quite impressive. This Huachimontones site developed in the state of Jalisco in Western Mexico. The next great empire that developed in the area occurred much later, by the 14th century. That's the Purepecha or Tarascan Empire. Purepecha is how they call themselves. Tarascan, Tarasco is the name that the Aztecs used to talk about these people. It was founded, this empire, by immigrants of unclear provenance. Did they come from the north? Were they Chichimecas? Did they come from South America, as the Purepecha language seems to have some relation to the languages spoken in Ecuador and Colombia? It's unclear. Perhaps they were even related to the Natchez of the Mississippian region, as the Natchez have similar cultural practices and some origin stories that may relate to a migration to the south. Regardless, the Purepecha claim to have arrived from the north, from a desert region, and they settled in the Pátzcuaro Lake region in the state of Michoacán, the present-day state of Michoacán, and they developed this city of Tzintzuntzan that you see pictured here, with the yacatas, these very peculiar keyhole-shaped pyramids. Tzintzuntzan became the center of a tributary empire, very similar in its political organization, perhaps more centralized than the Aztec state. And in fact, they were the second only to the Aztec empire and were able to keep the Aztecs away, perhaps due to their adoption of metal weapons. So this Tarascan empire, this Purepecha empire, became one of the most centralized polities in Mesoamerica. And it was still in place when the Europeans arrived after conquering the Aztecs. So we will talk about the Tarascans and the Michoacán region a little bit more in our series on the conquest of the Americas. So the Purepecha, therefore, are an empire founded by immigrants. Well, so is the Aztec Empire. These migrations of Nahuatl-speaking peoples occurred in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And that's how the Nahuatl-speaking peoples, the last of them were the Mexica, and the Mexica would eventually found the city of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, and they would develop the Mexica Empire, otherwise known as the Aztec Empire. But we will talk about the development of this empire and the city of Mexico, Tenochtitlan itself, in a future lecture. For now, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.